So let's invite to the stage Eitan Reisel, who is founder of VGames, and he will be talking today about how to get prepared for discussions with the game investors and what actually they are looking for, especially in the pre-seed and seed investments.
Thank you, Mariusz. Thank you so much. Actually, I love the fact that John was before me because I think he covered a lot of the high-level things about investments, and now we can really double-click. So before I start, I just want to refer to one of the questions that was asked in the previous session. I think, and John really nailed it right. When you're looking for investments, first target whoever you can get investments from. We'll talk about this a lot. If you have the opportunity to take from somebody that understands your category, I think that's totally the right strategy for any category that you're investing in. Okay, now let's double down on pre-seed and seed. So as I said earlier, I'm Eitan. I'm the founder of VGames. A little bit about my history in games. So I wasn't a gamer as a kid, but I've joined Google 2010, and then 2014. Got a really amazing opportunity to start gaming business out of Tel Aviv, working with a lot of the largest game publishers all around Europe and in the US. Really fell in love. I became a gamer. I play a decent amount of time every day, about an hour, but I'm a father of three, so maybe an hour and a half or two, depending if you call the fortnight hours of playing with my kids. I've left Google 2.5 years ago, started, as I said, doing angel investment in this space, and then started a fund, and I'll explain why in a second. So what I'd like to cover in the next 15 to 20 minutes is what are game investors looking for? Instead of using my template presentation, based on my conversation with Mariusz, I really tried to see how I can gather most of the questions that I'm asked on a frequently or daily basis, put them on the table. And of course, if you guys have additional questions, I'm more than happy to hear. And we're going to focus mainly on pre-seed and seed. We do invest in later stages, but it's really to double click on what John already shared. So what is this not? I'm not going to share in the next 15 minutes how the best deck should look like or what the right template is. Okay, it's really what we as investors care for. I think I'm speaking in the name of many investors because I think the early stage folks are looking pretty much for the same thing, maybe on different angles. But it's really, these are the places where if you come to us and you pitch, what are the important things that we hear? Okay, so I like to call this the triangle. The triangle meaning, how do we look? And I think John covered some of these points already. So one, team, and I'm going to double click and elaborate on each one of them. Team, of course, is the number one factor when we look into an investment. The reason is an investment is like some sort of marriage. It's going to have its ups, it's going to have its downs. We have to make sure that we're on this together. We're aligned on the vision. We're aligned on the strategy. And I always call it the cup of coffee test or exam. When I pick up the phone and I call my portfolio companies, or when they pick up the phone and they call me, they would like to have a cup of coffee with me and not, we have to talk to Eitan again. So I think team, and we'll talk about the experience and what we're looking for is super important. Of course, game, genre, category. Again, we'll double click on that. And then the biggest question when you get to pre-seed and seed investments, what data should we be looking for, right? Because if it's a pre-seed investment, I don't know if everybody understands, a pre-seed investment is usually a team and a presentation. Seed investment is usually a team and presentation and a little bit of progress. So there's not a lot of data to show. And I'm sure there's a big topic around what, if I don't have any data, can I approach investors? How can I approach investors, etc. Okay, so let's start before anything else of what we're looking for. A good pitch or a good story when you approach an investor, and I agree with John, it's better off be from some sort of colleague or referred to us and not just only a cold email, because at the end of the day, I get in general around 4 leads a day. So we want to make sure that, we have, and when we get from people that we respect and good connections, of course, it will get more attention if we like it or not. But when you're coming to us, the first thing is, remember, we have to hear a good story. We hear many stories. And when we hear a good story, something that we relate with, something that we feel connected to, we'll, of course, want to deep dive and understand more or learn further. On this front, the only thing I'd like to say as a tip is try to learn or do some due diligence on who you're talking to before you approach them, because I think, if you see our webinars and news and PRs, etc., if you see how we think about things, I think you can tailor the story better to what we're looking for. And the second thing, and probably maybe this is one of the most important topics that you encounter as a pre-seed and seed investor. Not every investment is an investment opportunity for us. And some of the investment opportunities are much more publisher opportunities. Now, I think this by itself can be a session. If I really are looking for the three pillars of should I target an investor and should I target a publisher, I would look at three components. One, these are totally different strategies. If you're looking to build a company that's an independent company to self-publish your game and take it to be a big title that can generate a lot of money, and as John mentioned, generate value for you as founders and for us as investors, probably more on the investor front. If it's more a game-by-game strategy, most likely it's going to be on a publisher front. The dreams or strategies are a bit different. Where you want to be in the next 3 years, 5 years in terms of a company, cash that you'd like to meet during the way, etc. And then, of course, again, without going too much into details, is there are different games. There are games that are very, very heavy in terms of building mechanics, tech, that a lot of investment is going into the infrastructure itself, and then you do need a third party to support you. And then there are games which are more loose and easier to bring into the world, and then they're probably more investors. So it doesn't mean that we don't invest in AAA or very, very deep tech games, but still we'll have to make sure that the capital and the strategy of the company is one, not only to do one hit or what we call super indies, but to build a roadmap and really build value creation over time. Okay, now let's go back to our triangle, right? Team, game, and data. So I'd like to cover each one. First is team. And now really, this is where I'm going to emphasize most of my effort, because that's actually where the majority of due diligence is done when we do pre-seed investments. So why is this so important? First of all, as I said before, this is a relationship. We're going on for a long-term relationship, and we have to make sure that we have common grounds. We come from cultures that we understand, right? This is really on a personal angle more than anything. Second, experience. Now, I've got this question a lot. Is it important here? I even put it on the slide that I have experience in games. So I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to put a disclaimer on this. We meet many founders, or I meet many founders who come with beautiful resumes. They worked in the top gaming companies in the world. But if you ask them if they've ever launched a game into the market, many times it will be, I took the game from $100 million revenue to $120 million revenue, which is amazing. I personally did not do that, but it's still something that there's a big difference when you take a game into the world or when you take a game from a certain level to the next level. And me as an investor, I'm much more interested in taking a game into the world. So I less care for the brand. I care for the experience in the gaming world to understand what does it mean to publish a game, take it out to the world, initial metrics, improvement, etc. So yes, experience matters. But on the other hand, don't feel uncomfortable if you don't come with big brands in your resume, right? And a lot of the early stage stuff we do is young folks. A lot of the games that they built were stuff that they did as kids, and we're still very supportive. The second thing in terms of founding team, then it's very important to understand, one, how the functions are divided, and two, not only how the functions are divided, but how you as founders complete each other. So if there's one founder that's very, very strong in product, and then there's another founder that's very strong in product, who's going to take on the tech? Who's going to take on the monetization? Now, it doesn't mean that every team of founders have to have all three pillars, but it totally supports that the more knowledge we have at the founder level and the more differentiator that we have among founders will support the success of the company. And the third thing I'd say about the founding team is that if you've worked together in the past, you went through the hard days and the amazing days and the excitement and the downs, and you already have the stickiness of a team, of course, it gives us more comfort as investors. But team is not only founders, of course, it's also team members, because, you don't also want 10 founders. And why is this so important? So the first thing that I look into is not only the founding team, but who are you as founders able to attract to your team? That says a lot about your leadership skills, right? So we're an early stage company. We don't have a lot of money to pay. We don't have a lot of ease up to share. And even if we do, it's not valued that much because we're only starting. But if you can still get people, and one, they can compensate for the experience that you're missing, and two, they're strong in what they do, that's a very, very good sign on leadership factors, right? So if we want to see a team of founders and the team itself, we want to see a combination that this team together can take this game into the world. Now, I get a question of what is the right size of a team? That's a great question. I don't have the answer because it really depends on what game we're building, what should be, how lean should the team be to get something to the world to prove the concept before growing? Should we start with a larger team? I think the correlation between the type, the category, if you're building a AAA versus mobile casual versus a PC game, that will probably differentiate how much money or burn you should be spending, and of course, the size of the team. Okay, so with that, let's move on to the second pillar of the triangle, which is the game. So what do we care for in the game? First of all, and I think John covered a lot of these topics, and again, let's just elaborate a little bit more. So when we look into a game, remember, we're looking at a presentation. You're going to tell us that this is the next big thing, which we believe, because if you believe and you're devoting your time and effort and money into it, and of course those families, etc., when you're an entrepreneur, everybody is in this cycle, then we want, or I want, that you prove to me why this game has the potential to be so big. Why this genre, why the match or mismatch or mixture of genres is so unique or so important, right? We all understand that we're living in a very, very, very competitive scene. Gaming is booming, but when gaming is booming, that means that there are a lot of developers coming in from indies to the largest companies in the world, building beautiful titles. Why is my game different? Why are people going to play on my game? On what platforms are people going to play on my game? And if we don't have good answers for that on the pre-seed, and it should be backed by data showing competitive metrics, showing some maybe App Annie data, showing why we believe that the combination of two genres can create one big monster that does not exist, it's going to be very hard for us, even if it's an amazing team, to be convinced. Okay? As I said, competitive landscape is super important. How does marketing landscape look like? I'd like to see some benchmarks. How do we approach the marketing angle? Because if we only do paid, and we're competing against the giants, even if we invest $100 million into this company, they probably have more cash, right? What do we know that others don't? Or why do we know this that others don't? Many times this can come back to our expertise. Maybe we've worked on games that were different. We have that experience, and now we can bring that experience into new categories. And of course, and I'll touch upon this in the next slide as well, content has to be unique and has to be king, because if we're coming with something that's pretty similar, it doesn't mean that you can't create copycats that are successful. But the risk versus opportunity, the risk gets much more weight. Okay, and then maybe just to emphasize, we know that discoverability today in games is probably the most difficult part, right? So if we really want to challenge ourselves, right? Before you come to investors, you're first challenging yourselves on if you believe that you have that angle or not. If you believe, convince us why you believe that should be, the right mark for saying, okay, it's not only that we're a very strong team, but we believe that we have a strong game, although it's still on a deck and not live. Founfer, you want to?
May I please jump in with a question, or actually two? Going back to your previous slide about
Sure.
A unique genre and competitive situation on the market of a given idea of a game. We have a question on Slido. So there's one for you. How important is the genre in the whole investment that you are considering? And then the second one, a follow-up question. Do you have some genres that you prefer when making a decision?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So the first one, so let's take an example. A company can come and say, I want to build the next Homescapes, right? Homescapes is, for those who don't know, is the company where the publisher is Playrix, right? They're a very big company. They spend a lot of money on marketing unbelievable titles. I'm addicted to Homescapes. I actually told that to the founders not long ago. If you're building another Homescapes and you don't have a very strong angle to be the next Homescapes, how are we going to compete with them? What are we unique in marketing? We're unique in content. Maybe we are using a strong IP, but for me, genre is at the end of the day how we come into a world with, or it's untapped, which is hard today because we're very, very crowded. And two, even if we come to a world that's relatively crowded, what's the new angle that we're bringing into that genre, okay? And then on the second question, I'd say it's, so I'd like to say that we would invest in anything. There are categories where it's going to be very hard to convince me that there's still room. I'll give you one example. I think hyper casual today is very, very, very crowded on the top level. So it may be interesting for indies, for me as an investor to take and build the next Voodoo. I think that's super, super difficult, especially with IDFA coming along, et cetera, et cetera. And if we go on the other front, right, we have John here from Huge Games and Social Casino, right, that we have very, very big players, very, very defensive in terms of marketing, et cetera, right? So I'd like to say that I would look on anything, right? Besides gambling, I'd look at anything, just so that we don't invest in gambling. It's nothing personal here, but again, we have to be convinced that there's still room for new categories. And we have 7 portfolio companies in the fund. We're only 6 months year old, so I believe that there are still a lot of opportunities in the market. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to give the dark side of here, although the presentation is in black. But but it's really, and maybe just to cover that point, I think the most important thing is the founders have to convince themselves. Forget about us. Investors are not important. They're the ones that are devoting. I have a portfolio. I'm going to put some money here, some money there. Of course, I love everybody and will invest time, but they have to believe that there's space for what they're building. Otherwise, they're going to waste now 2 years, 3 years, right, on exactly that. So if they're convinced, they should be convincing me. If they're not convinced, then there's a different issue.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. So we're almost there. Okay, and last is data. I think this is probably the most difficult one, but I'll try to be as humble and as possible. Okay, so do I need data, right? Isn't the idea enough? But we are a strong team. Okay, so folks, I'm going to be very, very transparent here. Raising a pre-seed and seed rounds are not easy. They're not easy because if the investor doesn't know you personally or has personal connections, he's really betting on the due diligence that he does, especially in the world that we're living in now, that I'm making decisions through, we're on Google here, so Google Hangouts or Zoom or whatever, Skype, whatever, just to cover all the tech companies. So of course it's easier when we know the teams. So to answer on a simple note, no, we can invest without data. But if on the triangle, we have a question mark about the team or a question mark about the game, I personally will want to see data. Now, we'll talk in a minute about how do we get to data without fundraising, and I think there are ways to do that. But again, just to put this in one box, because I think this is a very, very important topic, is if you tick the boxes on team and game, high chances we'll move forward. If we have question marks in one of the both, there's high chances we'll want to see data. Now, before I go into what data is important, how to do that, right? So it can be of building the first game as a work for hire. It can do it while developing at night while having a full-time job somewhere else. I know these things aren't easy. In general, entrepreneurship is not easy, but sometimes that's the leap of faith that you have to show and the initial metrics that you have to show to move on with investors. Now, if we do want to see data, I think I'm emphasizing my point here with one word just in many times. Retention for me is the number one factor. Day 1, day 7, day 14, day 30, and that's pretty much enough before depth. The reason is because I think this shows so much about the game, right? Before anything else, before ARP, DAO, RPPU, POW, DAO, whatever. It shows that people want to play your game, and then I promise I'll help you find the monetization solutions if we have strong retention metrics. Of course, then the next layers of data will be monetization, ARPDAU. We want to see growth curves on all the metrics, POW. But again, if we need to prioritize, if you come with strong metrics on this, to be honest, on the pre-seed and seed, I really less care of these metrics. You know, show me that there's a business thinking and we'll figure it out. So to summarize, team, game, data. We're not 100% sure here and here. On the pre-seed, we're probably going to emphasize and ask yes to see some initial metrics. Just one before we end. Why Central Eastern Europe? So I actually fell in love with this region many years ago while at Google. I think they're the most talented people in this region that are building the best games in the world. And that's why we as a fund really put on our frontier of deep diving and analyzing and building alliances to find opportunities. And I can promise you that in the next year, I don't want to say many because I don't know, but we will do at least 1 or 2 investments in the region. It can be a pre-seed investment, seed investment, or a later stage investment. So with that, please don't hesitate to contact us. The best way to contact us is just to go. I personally answer all the contact us forms on our website. It's vgames.vc. I also have a blog post there where you can read a little bit about how the way I think about the industry, etc. And please just make sure that you cover the points that we discussed. Will just make your life and my life easier. So with that, I think we're done. Thank you.